Antisemitism began in the first millennium AD, when leaders in the Catholic Church blamed Jews, the guys with the black things on their head, for the death of Jesus. Back then, since not many people actually knew how to read, and not many people had access to a Bible, they didn't really care to look in the Bible to see whether or not Jews were to blame. Today, most historians and Bible scholars recognize the fact that it was the Romans that killed Jesus, not the Jews. Jewish culture and religion prohibits them from killing anyone at any time near a Passover feast, and in the Jewish culture, that's not something you really want to miss. Taking all that information, there's not really anyone left to blame but the Romans. Jesus was arrested by Roman soldiers in the Garden of Gethsemane, crucified later on a Roman cross, and pierced by a Roman soldier in his side. Moving on. Later, during the Dark Ages, when the Black Death was going around and many were dying, people started pointing fingers. Contrary to popular belief, not only were the witches blamed, but Jews were blamed too. Both were believed to serve the devil. Some people even went a step further and bought another myth, the blood libel. This was the myth that Jews used the blood of Christian children in rituals and served the Antichrist. All of these myths and stereotypes were started simply because the Jews would not accept Jesus as their savior. People thought that this was arrogant and that it was a sign that they served the devil, so they just went around spreading myths. Moving on later, we can see how a lot of people were affected by these myths and stories. Even before the Holocaust, many Jews were massacred in Germany. Jewish synagogues and houses were even burned down and destroyed, and Jewish cemeteries were desecrated, all without provocation from the Jews. During the early 1300s, anti-Semitism seemed to decrease a lot. Jews were allowed to engage in commerce and the free professions. This included things such as owning your own store, or maybe butcher shop, or being an artist even. Later on, Jews were allowed to engage in things such as government if they converted to Christianity. Many pretended to convert just to get the prizes that came along with it. In the early 1800s, Jews were given more freedom politically and socially, but many people were still being influenced by everything that had happened in the past, such as the laws against Jews and things that Jews were blamed for, like the Black Death. About half a century later, though, things started to get bad again. In the 1870s, Wilhelm Marr, a journalist, introduced the term anti-Semitism and defined Jews as a slave race incapable of salvation by conversion. In 1875, anti-Semitic people began to get the idea that Jews were a weak race with a drive to rule the world. By marrying non-Jews, they could spread that drive. Later on, the belief arose of social Darwinism, which said that humans are not one species, but divided into several different races. After World War I, more Jewish conspiracy theories arose. Jews were believed to have started the war in Europe to bring Europe financially and politically into ruin, and somehow make Europe more susceptible to Jewish control. At this point, people were just trying to look for things that most of the time weren't even true to try to make Jews look bad. In 1905, a book named Protocols of the Elders of Zion appeared in Russia, that raised conspiracy theories about exposing a Jewish plot to rule the world. It was later debunked, but it still continues to influence anti-Semitic groups. In the late 1940s, as Hitler finished his conquest of the continent, Jews got trapped in Europe. They were forced to wear yellow stars so that people could easily recognize them as Jews. In some ways, it was even worse than post-Civil War segregation. Jewish children weren't allowed in school, public playgrounds, swimming pools, and parks. Not only were they not allowed, they weren't given a separate school, playground, etc. In the beginning of 1933, Nazi groups burned many books written by Jews such as Albert Einstein. These were replaced with Nazi writings that taught children blind obedience to the Nazi Party. Some people, righteous Gentiles and humanitarian groups, hid Jewish children. Sometimes, although rarely, they would even hide whole families. They would give the children false documents and raise them like their own children. In 1936, during the Olympic Games in Berlin, anti-Semitism wasn't as harsh, so to speak. Hitler didn't want people to think that Germany was this cruel country, which it was, and so moved the Olympics to another country. After the Games, though, everything went back to the way it was, an anti-Semitic, cruel country. Concentration camps began when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Then, Jews began to be mass murdered. The media tried very hard to hide this anti-Semitic nature of the Nazis. When the concentration camp in Buchenwald, Germany, was discovered, the Henderson Daily News put the article at the very bottom of the front page. Many other newspapers and magazines, such as Time, did this so that only an avid reader could find this kind of news. Even after the war, Jews were afraid. They didn't want to risk staying in Europe and facing the hatred of their neighbors. Many lived in houses owned by Russians, in areas occupied by Russia, and many others just moved to Russia. Even with all the evidence proving the Holocaust to have been a true event, such as picture evidence and the Diary of Anne Frank, many deny it ever happened. The Iranian president has even said to himself that the Holocaust was made up by Jews just to get attention. Even in America, in some colleges, Jews are faced with anti-Semitism from other fellow college students. Anti-Semitism has caused so many problems throughout history. I know it may sound a little cheesy and cliche, but the history of anti-Semitism needs to stop today.